Welcome to the webinar today on how to have conversations about mental health. This is being delivered by the Wellbeing Line and should only be about 30 minutes. So please take the opportunity now to pause the webinar, get comfortable and grab yourself a drink. My name is Jess.
And my name is Rebecca Paris.
And we'll be taking you through an overview of how to have a conversation about mental health. It's only going to be an overview as we can only cover so much in a mini webinar, but if you are interested and want to find out more, please contact us. Our contact details will be on the slides at the end or they're on our website.
So nothing is intended to be difficult or triggering today, but we will be talking about mental health and how to support someone who might be struggling. But in this, please look after yourself. So if you need to pause and step out, please do so. It really is the most important thing. By the end of this webinar, you will know what we mean by mental health, why having conversations about mental health is important, what might prompt a conversation about mental health, something about the fears and blocks to having conversations about mental health, how to prepare yourself for a conversation about mental health, what skills you can develop that support having conversations about mental health, how to address challenges we might encounter when having these conversations, and how to bring a conversation to an end compassionately.
So what is mental health? There can still be a taboo and a lot of misunderstanding around the words mental health. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. So mental health is something that we all have, just as we all have physical health, and we need to look after both. Mental health is not binary, it fluctuates and it's more like on a continuum. So from feeling healthy to having mental ill health. Therefore, we need to move away from the feeling that to struggle with our mental health is a sign of weakness. We all need to look after our mental health, and so we need to talk about it and have these conversations. So why do we need to have conversations about mental health? We're all human and experiencing distress is a common aspect of being human. We can think of this like a bucket. So we all have a capacity or reserve to deal with stress. And as we go through life, our buckets can get filled with different things that impact on us. So common stresses we might experience include sickness or illness, bereavement and loss, relationship difficulties, work pressures, sleep difficulties, different life events, and financial difficulties. Often people are carrying these stresses in their buckets without us or others knowing, but it's the impact that we do see. So perhaps when a colleague doesn't seem like their usual self, or people seem withdrawn, seeming more stressed, for example. Plus, some of us will have predisposing or risk factors already in our buckets. People can be struggling with their mental health without being mentally ill, but sometimes we might tip into mental ill health. Having conversations about mental health provides us with an opportunity to understand what stresses might be impacting someone at work and to offer support or signposts to support. The conversations are intended to be caring and compassionate, providing the space for the person to explore things that might support their mental health and focusing on what's important to them. So these conversations are ongoing and dynamic. Mental health is not static. It can fluctuate and change a lot, especially as we experience different stresses and different life events, and depending on how full our bucket is. Mental health conversations are a way that we can regularly check in, engage, and demonstrate that this isn't just a tick box exercise, but it's an opportunity to build working relationships, to really make time for people, recognise and celebrate the things that are going well as when we might need a bit more support. So the majority of the content that we'll cover today will speak to having mental health conversations with colleagues or with staff. But the content of this webinar can also be applied to conversations with patients, with friends or family members, with anyone. And it's important to remember that not everyone will be receptive or ready to have a mental health conversation. So we know it can be hard for people to connect with others and to reach out for support. We're often better at offering support to others than we are to ourselves, and we might struggle to accept compassion or help from others for various reasons. So we might think it's not for me, or I don't need this, I'm too busy. Maybe because we're not in a clinical role, or we prefer not to discuss these things perhaps at work. Therefore, we might brush it off or feel uncomfortable and unsure how to respond. Many of us have difficulty showing and feeling compassion towards ourselves, and we can often operate a double standard. So we judge ourselves much more harshly than we would someone else who's in a similar position. Keep this in mind. It might feel difficult for the person that you're supporting to reach out or to accept the support that you're offering. And you can acknowledge this verbally, saying something like, I appreciate this might be difficult or has been difficult for you to speak about, but it's great that you've been able to reach out or that we can talk about this now. So offering empathy and encouragement. If someone does not want to have a mental health conversation, it's important to offer different options. So, for example, a gentle reminder that support is there if they would like to access it, and ensuring there are up-to-date posters in staff areas with details of what support is available so that people have different avenues they can reach out to. It's also important to bring in self-compassion here, recognizing that you have offered the conversation, which is really important. And often this has more of a positive impact than we can see or know about, even if the person declines at the time. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're all human and we will all experience a number of different life events. Some of these will likely be difficult or distressing, and distress and mental health are interlinked. So, sometimes a mental health conversation might be planned, or more often they might be responsive and unplanned. So, when we know someone's going through a difficult time, perhaps. It's important to have everyday mental health check-ins, as well as perhaps more formal conversations like in appraisals or one-to-ones. So particularly if you're a manager, it's important to have these kinds of conversations and check in with your team regularly, rather than waiting until there's a particular concern. As we mentioned earlier, we might not be aware of what people are carrying around in their buckets, so it's important to check in regularly and formally. Mental health conversations are not intended to be therapeutic interventions or judgmental. They're not meant to be performance related or a formal mental health assessment.
So what might be some of the fears and blocks to having conversations about mental health at work? Having mental health conversations can sometimes take a lot of courage for the person sharing, but also for us who are having them. There are some common fears and blocks that we might come across. We might fear not knowing what to say. So it's important to remember that anyone can have a mental health conversation, and the key is about offering the space and time to listen to someone. We always want to say the right thing, but sometimes we worry about saying the wrong thing. If we do, we can just acknowledge this and try again. Remember, the purpose of the conversation is to be compassionate. So if that is the intention, then hopefully this will help guide us. Similarly, sometimes there can be concerns of becoming over-involved. So it's important to remember that this is just a conversation. We don't have to solve everything in the moment or offer counselling or therapy to that person. Again, asking for help is key. If you're concerned about the person, the aim of the conversation would be to signpost them and support them to access the appropriate support. When someone was upset, we often feel like we have to fix it, make them feel better. But this is not always what the person wants. Just think about how you might experience a conversation. We sometimes just want people to listen. So there are times when we just want a place to share how we're feeling, especially if we're struggling. Sometimes we can worry about what the conversation might bring up for us. For example, if a colleague has recently had a bereavement and you'd like to check in with them, but you've also recently had a bereavement. So therefore, it's important to look after yourself too and ask for help if you need it. Perhaps in this case, it'd be more beneficial for you both if the person were to have the conversation with someone else, a different person within the team. Sometimes we worry we might upset them more. Often it's very difficult when we are sitting there talking to someone and someone begins to cry. It can be hard to sit with someone when they are so visibly upset, and we might feel that we've caused this. However, if you've noticed that they're not themselves, then it's possible that there are other things that will be impacting on this, and that starting to talk about this will have opened that up. We might worry about making things worse. This can be a particular concern when people are talking about suicidal thinking, suicidal ideation. There can be a fear that asking someone about it will make them think more about suicide, and it might be a risky thing to discuss. But actually, we know from research that asking about suicide doesn't actually increase the risk of someone. It can, if anything, it can help mitigate those risks. So to help us to understand how we can slow down in these moments and think more clearly when we're having these mental health conversations, it can be helpful to broaden our understanding of how our emotion regulation systems work. So some of you might have seen this diagram in previous webinars or talks that the Wellbeing Line has delivered. And we can illustrate this by using the 3 systems model, which comes from the compassion focused therapy model by Paul Gilbert. This is a model that derives from neuroscience and evolutionary psychology, and it suggests that we have 3 main systems that we use to regulate our emotions and behaviours. And they each have their own unique job to do, but hopefully they work in conjunction with one another. So briefly, the red circle down the bottom is our threat system. So it's designed to protect us and defend us from harm. It's often known as fight or flight and involves emotions like anger, anxiety, and disgust. It's associated with the hormones cortisol and adrenaline. The blue circle up the top, that's our drive system. This is associated with achieving our goals. It's to do with attainment, to doing things, meeting our basic needs for food and shelter, for example. These 2 systems are quite high energy systems. And to counterbalance these and help regulate us overall is our green circle, the soothing system. This is designed for the balance, offering us a chance to recuperate, to rest and digest and regain that energy that we've used in the other 2 systems. It's linked to feelings of relaxation, contentment, connection, and safeness. So how would this relate to preparing and having a mental health conversation? So if we think about what might activate our threat system, we might have worries and negative thoughts. We might worry about, what if I say the wrong thing? So our red circle, our threat system, has been activated. And that might be less helpful for us both in the conversation. So for ourselves, but also the person we're talking to. Conversely, if we do some things in the blue circle, such as preparing for the conversation or attending this webinar, we might be more likely to be in our drive system when approaching the conversation, which is more helpful. Likewise, it can also reduce our threat level because we'll feel more prepared. By getting into our green system through things such as approaching our own thoughts with compassion, using breathing exercises, we're likely to be better able to engage and regulate ourselves and our emotions. And we can also help regulate the person themselves. So therefore we can slow ourselves down, we're allowing our thinking brain to come online, and then we're reducing that kind of response from the threat system. This is putting on our own oxygen mask first. And by doing this, we are regulating ourselves, but we can help co-regulate the person we're speaking to. So how do we prepare for having a mental health conversation? So if the conversation is planned or scheduled, or you've noticed something and you've decided you want to speak to that person, it's really important to think about a few things before we launch into that discussion. So what do we know already? Do we know anything about any of the current stressors or difficulties for that person? Is this the first time you've tried to have a conversation with that person? We can also think about clarifying the expectations for that conversation. So ensuring that the person knows that it's not punitive or disciplinary, it's a check-in and it's not a counselling session. So you're really setting the boundaries around that conversation. We can prepare ourselves, so we're more likely, as we said previously, to have a helpful and productive conversation if we're calm. Calming that fight or flight, that stress response, bringing compassion to ourselves and recognizing that we're not necessarily mental health experts, but we can have a big impact encouraging people to talk about this. We can think about how we might begin or approach that conversation. Thinking about this in advance, it can be helpful. We can think about where might be the right place to have the conversation. Do we have enough time to have it? Can we create a safe space, both physically and psychologically? Can we make sure that we're not going to be overheard or interrupted? And even if the conversations is unplanned, we can consider this in the moment. So like I said, sometimes we cannot always plan for the conversations that we're going to have. Sometimes we might be having a conversation about something else, and then we might be caught off guard. Always remember, at these points, we can still put in some boundaries and containment around the conversation. If we're worried about time, we can be proactive at this point and plan to speak to that person later in the day. If we're worried about how we might respond, we can take a breath and just listen. We can remind ourselves that we don't have to problem solve in that moment. If we're worried about what's being shared, we can still slow that person down and set some agreements and boundaries in place before they say anything further. If we're worried about where we are, we can again slow that person down, find a quiet, private space and have the discussion there where they feel both psychologically and physically safer to have that. And just a reminder, it's also okay to set a compassionate boundary. If a colleague would like to have a conversation about mental health, and it's not a good time, or you don't feel that you are ready or in the right headspace, or you don't have that specific amount of time to do that, you can explain that you really want to listen and you can agree to a time to talk so that you can give that person your full attention and enough time to have that conversation. So even if we've had lots of time and put in lots of thought into preparing for a mental health conversation, we might still find the conversation difficult to approach. Maybe we feel some nerves about thinking about how it might go or how it might be received. We might experience feeling anxious. We might notice a response in our body, such an increase in our heart rate or sweating or feeling quite tense. We might especially notice anxiety if the conversation is unplanned or spontaneous. All of these responses are understandable and natural. And it's really important here for us to put on our own oxygen mask first and do what we can to soothe ourselves. So it's just like on a plane. If we don't put our oxygen mask on first, then we're not much help to others if we pass out. So one of the simple ways we can do this is by practicing a breathing exercise, intentionally slowing down our breath, finding our own soothing rhythm of breathing. When we experience anxiety or a stress response, it helps us activate our parasympathetic nervous system, or the green circle, the soothing system. It helps us to access our abilities to stop and think, come back to the present moment, and to slow us down and respond in a more helpful and thoughtful way. So how to open a conversation? Let's move on to actually having the mental health conversation. How would we do this? So here are some suggestions for starting a mental health conversation. It could be, how are you? How are you really? How are things going? Would it be helpful for us to talk about? How are things inside or outside of work at the moment? For some conversations, such as a mental health conversation as part of returning to work meeting, it might be helpful to use a framework to help structure the conversation. Mind have developed a wellness action plan, which has some helpful prompts to support, and the link is on this slide, and I'm also going to show it to you again on the next slide. It's also important to give permission to talk about it or not. So if someone doesn't want to have a mental health conversation, perhaps you could let them know that you'd be happy to talk to them another time, or if and when they are ready. You might want to clarify initially what that person would like from the conversation. And again, think about the timings, the space, and creating a safe space, both physically and psychologically, for when you do have that conversation. So just to reiterate, here's the link to the Mind's Wellness Action Plan. So you might want to take a moment to pause the presentation and copy the link. You can also Google Mind Wellness Action Plan, or the link will be available in the PDF version of these slides after the presentation. You can ask for a copy of the slides by contacting the Wellbeing Line. So how to respond when you're in that moment with that person? I think it's really important, again, for us to remember to activate our soothing system. So we're bringing our thinking brain online and just slow ourselves down. So take a step back. We don't have to respond straight away. Like we said, manage people's expectations, ask like what they would like from this space. Would they like listening and suggestions, or do they want solutions or pointing in the right direction and support? Practice listening without judgment. So offering empathy. An empathetic response is coming alongside that person, understanding their distress, noticing it, coming alongside and supporting them. Remember, you don't have to solve it. You might be one piece of that person's puzzle. There'll be other support that might be in place, or that you can direct that person to. Notice that inner critic in your own mind that might tell you have to solve it, you have to sort it out, you're not doing a good enough job. Just notice it, thank it for pointing those things out, and then see if you can focus back in on that moment and what the person's saying. It's really important to ask who is in that person's support network. Who do they have around them that might be inside of work, but also might be outside of work, that's supporting them through this.
As we mentioned before, we might worry about what to say in a mental health conversation, but actually it's more important that we focus on using those active listening skills. So active listening helps to build rapport, to focus the conversation on what's important to the person, and to form a shared understanding. A helpful way to remember some helpful active listening skills is the Samaritan's SHUSH acronym. So you can see on the slide here they created a poster to help anyone become a better listener. So the first one is show you care. So focusing on the other person, making eye contact, deliberately sort of putting away your phone, so limit any distractions. Having patience. It may take time and several attempts before a person is ready to open up. Using open questions, so that questions that need more than a yes or no answer and that need a follow-up. So you might say, tell me more about that. Saying it back, so summarizing what the person has shared with you to check that you've understood them. And having courage, so don't be put off by a negative response, and most importantly, don't feel that you have to fill a silence. You can sit there and listen, and let the person sort of think for a moment, gather their thoughts and speak to you. It's also important to be non-judgmental and culturally aware, so approaching these conversations sensitively and with curiosity, and being careful about things like touch. So again, that's part of being culturally aware and sensitive, so asking someone before offering a hug. And remember, you don't have to be a counsellor or therapist to develop or use active listening skills. So we can all do this, and these tips are really important for building and maintaining relationships, as well as having conversations around mental health. Connecting with others is a way that we can activate our green soothing system, and doing so has a naturally calming and regulating impact upon our threat system. So how can we trigger this system and connect with others? We know that the soothing system is sensitive to affection and kindness. So offering kindness and reassurance to others is important, but we can also trigger this internally. So using things such as self-reassurance and self-soothing, remembering times that we felt loved and cared for. So this works for both the person that you're having the conversation with, as well as for yourself. It's important to acknowledge that people connect in different ways. So some people like to have a hug, or some people prefer to be reached out to by text. If in doubt, ask the person what they would like from you, and be prepared to give suggestions, as they might not know, especially if they are quite upset or distressed. So some examples on the slide include a text message and an empathetic statement, making them a hot drink, just reminding someone that you're there for them, or offering to sit in each other's company, perhaps have lunch together. And just that reminder that you're with them, you're there for them. We know some of you will work virtually too, so when these things aren't always possible, it could be something such as sending a message, or just showing that you're thinking of them and that you understand what they're going through. So a reminder of some of the sort of common worries that you might have about these conversations and how you can manage them. So we've covered some of these already, but it's just to give some more examples of how we might manage this. So not knowing what to say. So it's okay if you don't know what to say. As we said, life can be really tricky and complex, and there is no one right thing to say. So sometimes, in fact, simply acknowledging this can be really powerful. So validating someone's experience, which can bring comfort during a challenging time. So an example would be saying, I can see why this is really exhausting. I can see why you're finding this really difficult. So your aim is to express that I see you and I believe you. Similarly, we might worry what the person will discuss in the conversation. So maybe we know they've been through something such as loss or bereavement, financial worries, a marriage breakdown, and sometimes we're not sure how to talk about these topics. So we might worry again about upsetting them. And similarly to above, validation and simply listening is important. So reminding ourselves that we do not need to have all of the solutions. And we might find it helpful to keep in mind the purpose of the conversation. So checking in, offering space to listen, and offering any support that we can. So we're not trying to fix the person's situation or resolve everything for them. Concerns about the person's safety. So perhaps they've disclosed experiencing suicidal thoughts or self-harm, or something worrying that they're experiencing at home. So when this happens, where possible, share your concerns with the person and explain that you think it would be important for them to have some support with this. And you can offer to help them access this support. So thinking about offering them some support to phone their GP, speak to their GP or their manager to help them call the crisis team or any other support services. If they do not want to access any support and you're very worried, explain that you need to share your concerns with someone else. Share that with your manager or with a safeguarding lead, for example. And finally, sort of discussing difficulties at work. So for example, the person might start to discuss dynamics in the team or difficulties in the team, or perhaps with a particular colleague. And that might be quite uncomfortable to discuss, or it might make you feel like you're in a difficult position. It's important here to focus the conversation on the person themselves, so the impact on them, what they're thinking and feeling about the situation, rather than offering any kind of, again, opinion or solution.
So how do we end the conversation sensitively? Sometimes it can be tricky or uncomfortable to bring a mental health conversation to an end, particularly if that person might have been quite upset during that conversation or the topics that were discussed were upsetting. It can be helpful to use the following suggestions to bring a conversation to the close in a compassionate way. So first of all, ask the person if there's anything else they would like to talk about, and then thank them for speaking to you. It's helpful to end the conversation by thanking them for sharing how they're feeling, because it's been quite brave to open up and talk to about it. It also helps signal to you both that these conversations are important and reinforces a sense of safety for future conversations and situations. Ask the person what they need. For instance, one person might want to carry on with normal work routines, whereas another person might need some time away from work. A person might be at direct risk, or there might be other people in the situation at risk. The person might either have a good support network or a limited support inside and outside of work, and it can be useful to consider this. As Jess said, if you have any concerns, share them early. Sometimes we have to do something in these situations. Think with them about where they might want to share this information, for example, their manager, their GP, their family. If we are really concerned, we might need to think about where we can share this with their permission. So, for example, their manager, or supporting them to make a phone call to the GP. Be open and honest about your concerns and how you'd like to help them, and keep them updated of the process if you do need to do something. So think about a plan together, as well as asking the person, share your concerns and say, what can we do about this to support you? Ask for their perspective. What's their plan for support or reaching out? And will you be checking in again? You might want to send some signposting information to that person, perhaps clarifying when you're likely to be able to do this. If you're not sure about what you can signpost the person to, it's best to be honest and say it will take some time to think or look into it and see what's available and get back to that person. And at that point, you can always refer them to the Wellbeing Line for them to contact themselves, or you can speak to us. Checking in again. Again, ask the person what they would like to do. It might also depend on the information that they've shared and whether there are any risks and whether there are any actions as well to follow up. You might agree to have a check-in to see how they're doing, or if there are no immediate concerns, you might encourage the person that they can come and talk to you again if they need to. You might also like to check in with the person about how they found the conversation. Did they find it helpful? Anything in particular they found helpful, or would they like to consider, what would be like they'd like to consider for future conversations? And finally, check in with yourself. Do something that will help you step away from that conversation for now. For example, taking a break or focusing on something else, and seek support for yourself if you need to. So what next? So as a reminder, you don't have to be the whole support for that person. You are just one piece of that puzzle. You are the work piece, potentially. You don't need to have all the answers or think about which service is right for them. So please direct them to the Wellbeing Line if they want an opportunity to discuss any of their concerns further and think about further additional support options. Or there might be some in the moment and crisis support available that they might need. And this can be accessed through NHS 111 and the crisis team in Gloucestershire. There are other support avenues such as NHS talking therapies, the employee assistance programs, HR, occupational health, and other websites that might be useful. But again, if you want further information about these, please contact the Wellbeing Line. And just a reminder, we can all be impacted by hearing something difficult, and difficult news can trigger our own feelings and experiences. So, as we always say, it's important to look after yourself too and think about your own support needs. Put on your own oxygen mask. So in summary, we're all human, and experiencing distress is a common aspect of being human. We can all benefit from having conversations around mental health. Sometimes we can experience fears and blocks to having mental health conversations. That's okay and perfectly normal. We talked about what might be helpful to consider before, during, and after mental health conversations to help us prepare for those and then end those conversations compassionately. And one more reminder, to look after ourselves and put on our own oxygen mask first.
We'll be ending the webinar shortly. Before we do, we just want to let you know that there are lots of ways that the Wellbeing Line can support you, your teams, and your organisation, which is free and confidential. Please reach out to us via phone or email to access our support. We work across the ICS and provide free confidential help to health and social care staff across Gloucestershire. We have a broad offer which includes at all levels, individual support, team support, support for team leads themselves, and support for the organisation as a whole. The fact that we're an independent service sitting outside of services such as HR and occupational health provides a level of safeness and confidentiality that is appreciated by staff and teams who use our service. If you would like a copy of the slides from the webinar, please contact the Wellbeing Line and we will happily share them with you. And you can see our contact details on the final slide. Thank you very much for listening.